My name is Spring Petta, and I am one of three presenters from Everett Community College, located in Everett, Washington, in the Pacific Northwest.
Allow me to introduce you to the presenters who will be sharing today. First, on the left, is Laura Wild. She will be speaking on behalf of a two-person team. Her co-educator and co-content creator is Nancy Vandenberg. Laura is also the faculty advisor for the student club Students for Environmental Action. Our next speaker is Jeff Fennell, who is a tenure-track science instructor in the biology department and has been a tremendous mentor to me as a new instructor. I'm not the only one who can pay tribute to his generosity and leadership. Finally, you'll see my photo as the newest faculty member in this lineup. At the time of presenting, I'm entering my second year of teaching at Everett Community College. The session is organized with the following components. The description will highlight what the audience can expect to learn and take away after attending. The definitions will not only describe meaning and context, but it will also reveal processes. Next, we'll explore three demonstrative applications with each of the three co-presenters. We'll wrap up the session with a brief conclusion and provide contact information at the end. This multidisciplinary presentation will demonstrate the use of place-based applications such as outdoor learning, the integration of Indigenous case studies, and the use of geography software, ArcGIS story maps. Social justice learning outcomes in sustainability-focused curriculum within an Indigenous language hotspot fosters rich connections between natural and cultural capital that can be universally applicable. Our audience can expect to gain best practices in curriculum modalities and pedagogical approaches to motivate a campus community toward a just transition. The title of this session is Social Justice in Learning Outcomes, Environmental Literacy in an Indigenous Language Hotspot. These concepts will be addressed in this order: social justice, learning outcomes, environmental literacy, and the Indigenous Language Hotspot. Our first definition is social justice. Everett Community College approaches social justice with a trademarked commitment. This commitment is known as the 5 dimensions of equity. The 5 dimensions of equity was established after a 3-year iterative process in 2015, engaging students, faculty, staff, external partners, and the broader community to explicate concepts within an educational ecosystem. The essence of the 5 dimensions of equity is social justice. This commitment is published on the school's website and serves as a foundational component to the institution's core learning outcomes, which we will discuss next. The 5 dimensions of equity was designed to reflect the voices of many and to recast traditional higher education frames of thought regarding aspiration, access, achievement, economic progress, and engagement. To reiterate, the essence of the 5 dimensions of equity is social justice. Everett Community College has 3 core learning outcomes. I've highlighted the third outcome for emphasis as it pertains to our topic. Recall the first half of this session title, Social Justice and Learning Outcomes, and this becomes a literal description. It's one thing to follow behavioral policy on equity. It's quite another when social justice is embedded into the core learning outcomes. The next definition is environmental literacy. Everett Community College strives toward environmental literacy through its multidisciplinary curriculum component in the Climate Action Plan. The curriculum examples in this session are representative of this. Here we see the sustainability page from the main website. Teaching environmental literacy demands a multidisciplinary approach. Sustainability-focused courses range in discipline from environmental science, botany, global studies, biology, anthropology, English, and nutrition. Here we find our first co-presenter, Laura Wild, who will share from her nutrition course, Sustainable Food Systems, What to Eat and Why It Matters. We can scroll up to find our second co-presenter, Jeff Fennell, who will share from his course, Survey of Environmental Science, Sustaining Our Earth. Finally, we'll hear from me, the final co-presenter on my course, Natural Science, Sustainability and Systems. Our next definition is the Indigenous Language Hotspot. Many are familiar with this concept. A biodiversity hotspot is a biogeographic area with a high percentage of irreplaceable plant life found nowhere else on the planet and is considered threatened. Similarly, an indigenous language hotspot is identified in concentrated regions of the world with the highest level of linguistic diversity, the highest levels of linguistic endangerment, and the least studied languages. According to the Linguistic Society of America, an endangered language is one that is likely to become extinct in the near future. Endangered languages are spoken by minority communities, and when a language becomes extinct, not only is there a loss of identity and traditional knowledge, but society at large loses important information about early history of the human mind. The Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages has identified roughly 20 language hotspots. These are areas in the world that are urgently in need of action and research. As shown here, Washington State is inside the area defined as the Northwest Pacific Plateau, a severely threatened indigenous language hotspot. The linguistic diversity we have now is absolutely irreplaceable. While this session is not about language revitalization directly, it is about connecting students to place and the ways Everett Community College engages this rich cultural landscape. The following 3 examples illustrate this point. Student government is known as student life, where life is an acronym and stands for leadership, inclusion, fun, and engagement. We'll also introduce examples of campus facilities and curriculum. Student life covers a wide breadth of roles and responsibilities. We're highlighting the First Nations Student Club, which gathers weekly to promote unity and community among the various Indigenous American groups on campus. On January 31st, 2019, Everett Community College hosted an opening celebration for the new gathering space for Native American, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander students. It was given a Lushootseed name that translates to the place of our way. It contains cedar planks covering the walls, books on tribal history, and patterned blankets folded on chairs. The gathering space was designed to evoke the atmosphere of a longhouse on campus. This team also collaborated to write the land acknowledgement for the college, which will be shown on the next slide. In addition to the student engagement, the campus also provides space for public cultural events. Here is an example of a Native Heritage Night. The event included a drum ceremony, which I will share with permission, along with the land acknowledgement. Another expression of campus facilities is through the artwork. Here I'd like to emphasize our numerous Native American art and totems. The metal artwork featured here was made by James Madison, a Native American artist from the Tulalip tribes. He states that he mainly focuses on artwork from his culture and adds a modern twist. This is evident in his self-portrait split personality featured on the far left. Influenced by European art history and his Tlingit and Salish cultural heritage, he unites these distinct traditions by applying carving methods to a contemporary aluminum sculpture. The way curriculum is influenced by this cultural landscape will be emphasized next with our first presenter. However, it's noteworthy to mention that the main campus of Everett Community College is located just 5 minutes from the Hebulb Cultural Center and Natural History Preserve. This makes field learning especially accessible and impactful. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our first co-presenter, Laura Wild. She teaches the concept of sustainable food systems as equitable, diverse, economically viable, and ecologically balanced nutrition. She will expand on how she changes students' lives through this hands-on lab course that blends environmental science with nutrition by combining traditional lecture with a campus greenhouse, kitchen, and community service learning.
Hi, my name is Laura Wild, and I'm a nutrition instructor at Everett Community College. I wanted to tell you about a lab science class that connects place to outdoor learning. And this class, Nutrition 180, Sustainable Food Systems, provides a framework for teaching sustainability in an integrated curriculum. The class was created in 2010 after Nancy Vandenberg and I, my fellow nutrition instructor, started to see students be very interested in local food. And we wanted to channel their enthusiasm into a lab science class that would teach them skills that they could use for the rest of their life on how to be better global citizens, but also how to improve their health. And so my background as a nutritionist began actually with a degree in environmental nutrition. And for 10 years, I was a master gardener. Nancy Vandenberg is a nutrition instructor, a registered dietitian, and also a sustainable community steward. It's kind of like being a master gardener for the environment. The class was created with the idea that we would blend environmental science with nutrition. We are what we eat, and what we eat impacts the planet. And that was our goal, to teach students that connection. As part of the class, we explore the concept of a sustainable food system, of course. And we describe that as being one that is equitable, diverse, economically viable, and ecologically balanced. In our class, we talk about things like structural racism in the food system. We talk about marginalized communities that produce food in our country. We look at the organic movement. We look at genetic engineering of our food. We talk about the Farm Bill, federal, state, and local policies that drive the kind of food that we have available in our society. It's a very well-rounded and far-reaching class. And we also look at what local foods are in our community, including those that are important to our Indigenous people that live in our area. Sustainable seafood is high on the list of topics that we discuss in the class, both in a historic context and as an ongoing item of our diet that we want to continue to eat sustainably. As part of the class, we have a 2.5-hour cooking lab every Thursday. And this has been absolutely invaluable for teaching concepts that we learn in the class in our academic work. Students often use the food that we grow in our campus gardens. That is a class project as well. And we have found that this is a really important skill for them to learn, because most of the students that we have these days come to us with a real deficit of cooking skills. And as much as we think that there might be some common knowledge out there, our experience has taught us that starting with very basic cooking skills just makes a lot of sense for our students. We have moved from a variety of classrooms. When we first started, we were in an anthropology classroom that had one tiny sink, a dorm refrigerator, and a lot of plug-in appliances. And most of the equipment that we have in our cooking classroom has been donated to us. So we've moved 5 times in 10 years. We're currently in a physics lab that has been converted to now accommodate a couple of refrigerators and a couple of stoves. And it's very close to our campus greenhouse, so it certainly suits our needs very well. And we have found that this hands-on application of what is being learned in the class is not only important for delivering skills that they can use long after the class ends, but it's really important for building community, which is something our students highlight as being one of the best aspects of the class. When you're sitting around the table, eating food with your peers, you can have really deep discussions on some of the topics that we're learning about. And you can also learn about each other's food traditions. And more importantly, you can create relationships with people that can be sustaining and long-lasting. We have heard from many of our students that this was the single most important class that they took during their time at Everett Community College, and that they are able to keep those bonds with their peers for years after the class ends. We built 2 food gardens as part of our class, and the food that is grown in these gardens goes to use in our class, but it's also used on our campus to feed students in need. We have a food pantry in the building behind these photos. And if we have surplus vegetables, our students are really appreciative of fresh produce because often that is somewhat hard to get in campus food pantries. Our science in these food gardens goes along with what they are learning in the classroom. So we compost our food waste in worm bins that is then added to our campus garden to enrich the soil. We learn about carbon sequestration in our soil through planting a cover crop. And we learn about the effects of climate change on the vegetables that we are growing. It very much is evident in a very short period of time in our work in the garden. Another part of the class is a 4-hour community service requirement. Students can choose to do that time at a local farm, in a community garden, or at a food bank. We instituted this policy because we felt it was important for students to make connections in their community and also to be able to see how their work can impact the community in a bigger way than just the campus community. This has been hugely successful. Our students have often commented that they made connections that led to job opportunities for them, and they also felt like they were giving back to their community in a very tangible way. It's not unusual for students to continue to volunteer after the quarter ends just because they've made that connection and it's so meaningful to them. It's no exaggeration to say that the Sustainable Food Systems class changes lives. This is what students have told us. It allows them to create some food independence, to feel as if their actions are making a difference, to put to use what they are learning in the classroom, and to feel part of a bigger community. We hope to continue to offer this class for years to come, and we would welcome any questions that you might have of how you might be able to create a similar class in your institution. My contact information is on the first slide of the presentation. Thank you for your time and attention.
Our next co-presenter is Jeff Fennell, who will share how he teaches environmental science through environmental justice. He'll provide practical applications on how Indigenous case studies can be interdisciplinary and how they can complement textbook curriculum, measure student performance, and even manage classroom behavior. He'll also provide a valuable source for Indigenous case studies that can be used in a myriad of disciplines in content learning.
Hi, my name is Jeff Fennell. I teach environmental science and biology here at Everett Community College. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I use these Native American case studies to teach the idea of environmental justice in my environmental science class. So of course, environmental justice is a big topic in our class. In the past, when I've asked students about examples of environmental justice issues, they oftentimes came up with examples from other countries, Amazonian rainforest, Southeast Asia, other developing nations. And although these are very valid, I wanted to bring home the point that environmental justice is an issue that affects not only our country, but our states and our local area. So these Native American case studies, they're a great way to bring these ideas into our classroom. So the case studies, they are free to access. They were put together by the Evergreen State College here in Washington. I have a link here. Here's the web page. It is very well put together. One nice thing about this page is the cases can be sorted by discipline. There's a lot of different fields that are touched on in these various cases, and they're really good cases. All of the cases are complete, and they come with teaching notes that you can look at, and I'll show you guys an example here in a sec, that have example questions and example ways of running the class with the case study. This is the longhouse that is on the Evergreen State College's campus, and in normal years, when there's no pandemic, I believe at least once a year, the college puts together a symposium where you're invited, And for the first day, you run through the case studies as a student. So you get to see how they operate. Then on the second day, you get to learn how to facilitate a classroom using the case studies. So I use many of these different case studies in my classroom for various reasons. The one I want to focus on today deals with the Yakama Nation. Let me jump to a map here really quick. Let me pull up my Google map. So my campus is in Everett, Washington, which is a little bit north of Seattle. The case study is focused on the Yakama Nation and the Hanford Nuclear Reservation on the dry side of the state. The state has a dry side. If you didn't know, Washington has some dry places. What happened is, so this is all in the case study. Back in World War II, the country wanted to have a place to process uranium for the nuclear weapon program, the Manhattan Project. And so the location, they were looking for a couple of criteria. One, it had to be near water to keep the reactors cool. So this is the Columbia River coming through here. This is actually one of the only parts of the Columbia River anymore that flows. There's a lot of dams on it. There's a dam right there. This reach right here is actually one of the few areas that actually flows. So it has access to fresh water. They wanted to have access to rail lines so they could ship out the products, and they wanted it to be fairly sparsely populated. And if you don't count the Native Americans in the area, which they didn't back then, it is sparsely populated. So this is the location. Let me kind of zoom in really quick here and show you what it looks like these days. So this is where they produce some 60,000 nuclear weapons. So as you look at it, it's just kind of a mess at this point. I noticed all this blue stuff. That can't be good. It is a museum, as I'll mention here in a minute. So over here, I believe this nuclear reactor is still intact. They're not functional anymore, but this is part of a museum. This is the location that we're talking about. So Yakama Nation land, this is their historical land. That's their reservation here. So even though they don't possess these lands, they do have treaty rights. They have treaty rights to utilize these lands for cultural purposes, hunting and fishing. They have all kinds of rights for these lands. And so a little bit of a background, and again, this is all in the case study. The case studies are really complete. Let me actually show you guys the case study here momentarily. So this is the case study that you can download from the web page I just mentioned. So it's 15 pages. Most of the case studies that I've seen are really complete. So there's pictures and background information. In addition to that, let me zip over here. There are the teaching notes. So I'll talk more about these here in a little bit, but the teaching notes, learning outcomes that they put together, who would this be appropriate for, and then some teaching ideas. And I'll talk about those primarily. That's what I'm using here, and various questions that you may or may not wish to use. All right, so Hanford, Washington is where they put it. So we talked about why that was. Some 60,000 nuclear weapons, the uranium for these weapons were produced out here. It was in operation from the 1940s up until 1987, as in the last reactor was decommissioned. As you can imagine, just a lot of nuclear waste, just a lot of waste out there, big footprint on the landscape. One of the issues is these nuclear projects, they were built with the intention of having a repository down the line for nuclear waste. That repository was never built. And so these places, and Hanford included, was never really designed to contain all of its waste forever, but yet it has to now. And so that's kind of where this case jumps in. The cleanup, the remediation of the landscape out there. So there's several players involved in this, the Department of Energy, the state of Washington, of course, Yakama Nation, but their voice isn't really as prominent as it probably should be. Kind of the crux of the case is, what does cleanup and remediation mean? What does it mean? What's the goal of this whole project? And these different players, they have different ideas for what this means. And I put this picture here, this little B-reactor monument. The case study makes the point that the US government, what they have essentially done is called it clean. They made it a national monument. There's a museum there you can go to. Actually on the Google Maps, some of the pictures that I found are from a tour bus. There's tours out there. And so the case study makes the point that this kind of sounds like, well, it's clean. I can go there with my family. We can have a picnic. We can see some history. It's probably safe. However, the Native Americans out there would strongly disagree because the land is not clean. They cannot fish it. You cannot eat anything off the land still. It's still very much not safe. It's not pre-nuclear conditions. How do I use this in the classroom? So there's a couple different ways that I use these. And this actually applies to the other case studies that I use from this repository. Number one, there are these thematic questions. In the teaching notes I showed you guys briefly there, what they've done for this case study is they've broken down a whole bunch of sets of questions based upon various themes. So as an example, I picked one here, justice and ethics group. So what I will do either online or in person, face-to-face, back when we used to have those classes, that small group would then be, for example, the justice and ethics group. And that group would then answer questions that are kind of dealing with that theme. We use Canvas online, so it's pretty simple to make small group discussions with these guys. 3 or 4 students online or face-to-face, they can work on these together. In a face-to-face class, what I will often do is have that group go to the front of the class and kind of share their thematic point of view and what they've learned of the case study. In an online class, well, I won't have them do that kind of thing. What I'll have them do is have each individual kind of share out what they've picked up from the class. So I have them do that. Another method that is really popular with the students is role playing. So in role playing, I have not done this in my online class, but I've done this many times in face-to-face. For the role playing, I assign different groups of students, different stakeholder positions. Department of Energy, EPA, and so forth, downwinders. This Hanford reactor, when it was in production, they estimate some 2 million people were affected by radiation leaking, and these are called the downwinders. This isn't necessarily just Native Americans. This is the Tri-Cities, some 3 big cities in Washington are downwind. As I mentioned, this is one of the small places of the Columbia River that actually flows, so it's pretty popular with outdoorsmen. So these are the stakeholders, and so what the stakeholders would do is they would kind of generate ideas for support of their position. What is their agreed upon position in this case from their stakeholder example. In the face-to-face class, I would then have them make a presentation to the class kind of from their point of view. I've also done something similar. Well, I have them do this in an online class where I give them a stakeholder position and have them present that as a PowerPoint or some kind of an online delivery to essentially an audience that is a community. So kind of a community meeting. There's the role-playing aspect of how to use these case studies. That works really well. Third way, what I do is I had these metacognition logs. Metacognition is thinking about your thinking process. Lots of research shows that it really kind of brings home studying methods. So what I will do is have them write some sort of reflection paper. This particular case study, the teaching notes, provides several questions that are really good for this. 4 major lessons you've learned. The whole idea is we're kind of focusing on environmental justice and ask my students, why was this case a good example of an environmental justice issue? Another thing that I have done, I started doing this summer quarter, since our campus has been online since March and it will be online until next March at least, I'm using the case studies to replace my exams. The degree of cheating on our campus was just through the roof. I just ditched my exams and instead I'll assign case studies. I'll give the actual case study like a week before, give them time to read it, and then I'll do these questions. I might give them a few thematic questions. I might give them a point of view and have them present something. So that's worked out fairly well. It's much harder to cheat with these open-ended questions. I get a better feel for if students are actually into this. If they happen to cheat, it's pretty simple because all their answers look the same, which I haven't had that happen. So that's good to know. So those are the 4 ways that I utilize these case studies in my classroom. With those metacognition logs, I get a lot of feedback from my students. And so this is a couple of comments from students that have gone through one of my case studies, and they're all positive. They all like it. My Native American students like that some of their struggles that they've been going through as a nation are being highlighted. Many of my non-Native students, they're shocked that our country, our nation today, our government today is still not treating Native tribes very fairly. We're all aware of what happened in the past, and we know things were bad then, but my non-Native students today think that the federal government is really looking out for everybody, and they're going to clean this up and make it safe for everybody, and it's really not the case. It's really not the case, and that's the key to this environmental justice issue. The last thing I want to show you is one great thing about these case studies is they are very current. I mean, this is not a done deal, and I live out here in Washington, and it seems like every couple of years it pops up in the news. There's been some kind of accident. They're actively trying to clean it up. There's stuff out there a couple weeks ago from when I'm recording this here in September. So this is not a done deal, and there's still a lot of conflict going on out there. These are the Enduring Legacies Native Case Studies. Barbara Smith is the woman in charge of organizing all this. If you have any question about the case studies, let her know. If you have a question about how I utilize these in my classrooms, certainly get a hold of me. I'll be happy to share with you. And thank you for your time.
Our final co-presenter is by your host, Spring Peta, and I'll share how I teach sustainability through systems thinking in the project-based learning approach. This is a teaching method where students work for an extended period of time on a relevant and complex challenge. I'll also share how I task students to choose their own course theme and thus direct their own area of research. I'll demonstrate how I implement the software ArcGIS story maps into this final project, and finish with student work samples and feedback.
Hi, I'd like to share with you how I implement ArcGIS story maps into my class, Natural Science 103, Sustainability and Systems. In order to give the full depth of how I use this software, let me introduce you to my class. I use project-based learning where students choose a system and they choose a geographic area. They then begin conducting research and applying the principles that they're learning in class. So in order to help facilitate that, I do have a library guide as well. This is the library guide, just to give you an idea. You can customize the tabs and decide what to put there. I do have a tab that explores scientific information just to really emphasize quality information that is useful for research. Once they do that research, I have them implement new technology skills. I say new because adding narration to a presentation is a new technology skill most students have not done before they come to my class. This presentation is very valuable, but it is not the project. That is then embedded into the ArcGIS story maps where they're able to tell a whole story about this area of research that they've spent the quarter on. Every student has their own system and their own geographic area. Therefore, their research is not exactly the same and their presentations are not exactly the same. The frameworks that I have them explore in these systems, first we look at systems thinking through the lens of the intervention points and the feedback loops from Dr. Donella Meadows. She outlines and defines the intervention points in her 1999 lecture. I've sourced that on the next slide. I provide lecture notes and an intensive quiz to ensure that students recognize these definitions and are able to apply them to another system. Our textbook, written by Brian Walker and David Salt, is still used in graduate studies at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where Brian Walker is still affiliated. This is where I found the 7 principles for building resilience. So here's the intervention points and feedback loops. There are quizzes, lectures, discussion assignments, a lot of activities around identifying the different parts of a system. Our textbook does an amazing job at introducing the complex adaptive cycle, and this also connects in with the 7 principles for building resilience. I've taken this illustration from the Stockholm University. Principle 1 is maintaining diversity. Principle 2 is managing connectivity. Principle 3, we take into account slow variables and the feedback loops. And principle 4, we understand and manage the complex adaptive system, and here's where the adaptive cycle comes in. Principle 5, encourage learning. Principle 6, encourage participation. And principle 7, promote polycentric governance. There's another intensive quiz. Students do a lot of discussion assignments around this, and then they have to locate evidence of them in the system they're exploring in that geographic area. This is an example of story maps. Once they get their research finished, then they do one of 2 things. They write their paper. These papers are not short. And some of them have done service learning. With the pandemic, I no longer require that, but that was something I like to have incorporated as well. Then they become a content expert. So with that information, I ask them to then share it. As I mentioned with the technology skills, they have to produce a presentation with the narration, and they talk about different facets. Sometimes they like to separate it out, or they only do the 7 principles for building resilience and they explore that, and they do another one for the complex adaptive cycle. It's very nice. Here we have a student focusing on the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. This particular student here, she's embedded photos, she's added extra links. You can see there the 7 principles of resilience and all the features of the research, the framework, and then she's embedded her presentation. I'm going to share that here with you.
My name is Raquel Parada, and today I am going to talk about the Brazilian Amazon rainforest social ecological system. The Amazon rainforest is located within the border of 9 South American countries, with the majority being contained in Brazil. It is the most diverse ecosystem in the planet. It absorbs large quantities of CO2 emissions, contains 20% of the world's fresh water, and 50% of all its rainwater returns to the atmosphere. These attributes makes the Amazon rainforest one of the key players on global climate change. The government promotes deforestation because deforestation will make more space available that can be used for agrarian practices such as cattle grazing and soy harvesting, which then will make profits. The profits will encourage the government to deforest even more. The adaptive cycle is divided in for loops and back loops. The system is currently in the rapid growth phase because the government is funding and finding new ways to experience economic growth, which has been found by exporting materials, logging, harvesting, and other practices. Now we're going to talk about the 7 principles of resilience. We have found that the rainforest has lost a lot of diversity and redundancy, and since 1975, there has been a loss of around 32 billion trees and 1 billion of animals. Principle number 2, connectivity. The system's connectivity is weak because the practices in the system are not sustainable. Principle number 3, slow variables and feedbacks. Some slow variables we have identified are the deforestation methods and the harvesting methods that can damage the soil with an overflow of nutrients coming from fertilizer and pesticides, and deforestation methods like the use of fire that can easily erosion the soil. We also have the regulations and laws implemented by the government. If regulations are weakened, a positive feedback loop is produced, but if they are reinforced, the laws, it might stop the deforestation and create negative feedback loops. Principle 4. The government is one of the main stakeholders of the system. They have not identified the system as complex and does not promote learning. The President Jair Bolsonaro came to power vowing to end or loosen up protections for forested areas inhabited by indigenous people in favor of the country's powerful agribusiness industry, and he has dismissed the findings of its own government scientific agencies as lies. Principle number 5. Learning. Learning is adapting and understanding while the system is changing. As we can see from the previous quote, the government is dismissing the learning of the system and that their activities need to change depending on how the other elements are behaving. Principle 6. Participation. Leaders are important for building a safe and open space for participation to happen, but the current government has displaced many indigenous communities for the sake of agribusiness, and there are no laws that protect them or give them the right to participate in the decision-making towards the rainforest. These actions make a broad participation difficult to reach, and it makes the system have an unhomogeneous perspective. Principle 7. Promote polycentric governance. The IBAMA, or IBAMA, is an anti-deforestation organization looking out for the rainforest. But IBAMA is under the jurisdiction of the government. So if the government is weakening regulations, they can do something else that follows those directions. This is a clear example of a monocentric governance. Conclusion. Although it is comprehensible that Brazil is using its natural resources to fulfill its goal, it does not mean that it is the only path they can follow. The government should also begin recognizing indigenous population as a significant element in the decision-making of what is done in the Amazon. Allowing indigenous populations to have the right to decide would mean that the principles 5, 6, and 7 are being implemented since the government and other organizations can learn from local and indigenous knowledge. Sustainability and improvement can only be made if all parties agree in communicating, collaborating, and learning from others. Thank you for watching.
The feedback from students is so valuable. I ask for it continuously to see if they are learning and if this approach is really impacting the way they see the world. It is my goal to change the way they see the world, to change the way they interact with it. I will close with providing a brief interview that I had with 3 students, and they didn't even receive extra credit.
I have an internship with a nonprofit organization, and they work a lot in third world countries working on sustainability there. So I kind of wanted to take a class that maybe help me with my internship and teach me more so that way I could bring things to the table. I really think learning about the systems component helped me a lot. You can't make something sustainable unless you understand the system. So I think that helped me a lot, is being able to break down and look at a system so that way I can apply like the 7 principles of resilience to make the system that I'm working on more sustainable.
Resilience thinking makes me look at like the world differently. I didn't really realize how much CO2 is put into making everything that we have. So I want to kind of like live a more minimalist lifestyle. Just thinking like systematically and using systems thinking it comes to play in everything you do. And now that I understand how pretty much everything is a system, you can really look at all the different components and use complex adaptive system thinking to help you with solving problems and thinking about the world. And it really broadens your view on everything.
Thank you for your time today.
We'd like to thank you for spending your time with us and close by emphasizing how an institutional social justice learning outcome, coupled with sustainability-focused curriculum, mobilizes students and the campus community into a just transition. Furthermore, sustainability-focused curriculum within an Indigenous language hotspot presents meaningful connections that can be universally applicable in any educational setting. Our goal today has been to ignite discussion and contribute ideas. Feel free to connect with us. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.